Welcome to those of you who are now entering. I'm going to wait about 2 more minutes before we start, so feel free if you need to grab something to drink or powder your nose, feel free to do that. We'll start in about 2 minutes. We'll just let a little bit more people show up before we get going here. Thank you. Again, for those of you that have already arrived and you're in, welcome. We'll start in about 1 more minute or so. I just want to let a few more people get in so they can get the information from the very beginning and some of the administrative functions associated with the webinar. Thank you all. 1 more minute. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started. I want to welcome all of you to how to get a better bench press. Even though this is not a Monday, which is bench press day, we're going to go ahead and talk about it. Have a lot of information to cover. Want to do it in a timely fashion to leave questions at the end. So before we get going, for those of you that don't know who I am, my name is Rodney Korn. I'm the Director of Education here at Eleiko. Been here for about 5 years and been in the industry for about 35 years, 25 years or so. I've been doing education. So I've worked with a number of different companies, and I'm very blessed and fortunate to be with Eleiko for my final stint in the industry and love what we do, love our equipment, and love the education that we're able to deliver. So thank you for being here. Patrick Warmel, who's our tactical training manager, also does some of webinars, and he does a lot of work, but he's more specific right now, focusing on our Navy or U.S. Navy education contracts. So we provide education for the U.S. Navy, and Patrick is busy getting that all prepared as we have a variety of courses that we're doing for them in the next coming months. So he won't be joining us, but he does do some of these webinars, and you'll see him in future dates. So that all said, I want to welcome everybody. We've got a fair number of people showed up, so I'm going to get rolling here. Just so you know, from administrative function, there are two different looks and feels to GoToWebinar. There's kind of a classic version, which shows up as a control panel. If you're on a computer, you got a control panel that has different topics or different tabs that you can click on. One of them will be questions. One of them may say handouts. There is a handout that is in the handout tab that you have. If you're in the new version, there's usually a toolbar, and a lot of times on a laptop or on your computer, it'll be across the screen and it might say materials. So there's materials, there's different functions that you'll see. There's a chat box, there's a question tab, and then there's materials. So in the materials is where you'll find the handout. All of this information that we're covering here today is in our Powerlifting Level 1 online course. And so you'll have access to all of this, all the graphics, and much more detailed information than what we're going to be going through here in a more comprehensive overall course. So I just want to let you know that that'll be there. This is recorded, so you will be able to get a link to it once we're done. You, within the next hour or within 24 hours, you will get a link so you can see the recording if you do wish. So I just want to get some of that out of the way. As we go through this, feel free to type in questions if you have them. I'm going to try to answer them as we go through. If I can't get to all of them, I do want to leave time at the very end so we have some time to specifically address your questions. So please feel free to write your questions. If you're a person who will forget it in 5 or 10 minutes, go ahead and send it in, and I'll try to go through them and look through them as we're going through, but I'm going to be doing both things at one time, so I don't want to get overly distracted, but I will leave time at the end. Okay, so all of that being said, thank you again for your patience. Let's get rolling. I want to start with a real quick, just 2 simple polls, because I want to find out a little bit of information about you, and that will help me to best talk and address this information to who you are and who's on the call. So the first question I want to ask you is, which of these best represents who you are? So are you strength coach, personal trainer, athlete, fitness enthusiast, owner, operator, or is there something else that you are? Might be some type of licensed professional. Go ahead and just jump on there. Perfect. I appreciate your guys' activity and involvement. That really helps me. Okay, so it looks like we've got quite a few fitness enthusiasts. That's great. Love to see that. Got a number of athletes here. Some strength coaches, personal trainers. Okay, so predominantly a lot of fitness enthusiasts and athletes who were involved in this, with some of the coaches and trainers. Perfect. And a few owners and operators. So the owners and operators are here. I deeply appreciate you guys showing up, because you guys are vital and important to coming from the top down. So as fitness enthusiasts or trainers, we're coming from the bottom up, but you guys are from the top down. So kudos to you and thank you for being here. And those are with others. I'm assuming it's more the licensed professionals that you are. Okay, so thank you guys very much. I appreciate that. All right, one more quick poll, and then we'll get going. The next poll that I want to look at is this your first Eleiko strength talk, yes or no? Okay, it's bouncing back and forth and back and forth. Okay, cool. So about 55%, 59%. Cool, 56 to 44, yes, new. So those of you that are new to these, welcome. Deeply appreciate your involvement here. Those who are returning, thank you for your continued support. And this is something that we're trying to do more on a monthly basis now and provide a variety of different information. So thank you for all that. Let's get rolling. Let's get into some of the discussion points we're going to talk about. So we're going to keep it simple. First off, we're going to understand some of the bench press mechanics. We're not going to get into massive detail because there's a lot to it, but we will discuss it. You're probably going to hear some things maybe that you haven't heard before. That's my desire, is I hope that you do get some things that you've not heard before. That obviously is a benefit. Okay, we're going to get into some movement assessments. This is going to be vitally important to helping you get a better bench press. And I'll talk to you about that when we get there. Technique, we're going to cover. And then again, like I said, all of this is in our Powerlifting Level 1 online course, that in that download, you'll have access and can do all that stuff. We'll talk about that at the end. So let's get rolling. As an intro, what I want to state is, before we can jump into the programming strategies, because a lot of people think, okay, in order to get a better bench press or in order to do any lift better, I have to get better programming. And that is true. We need to have appropriate programming. But before we get busy with programming, we have to make sure that we understand the technique and we're prepared to do what we're supposed to do appropriately physically before we can start doing that. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at the technique, which can be observed, coached, and then we can use a simple process for that. At Eleiko, we have systems for everything, because in order to have reproducible results, owners and operators, You want a staff and a team that can get reproducible results. So it's not a one-shot deal, or you're not just shooting thing, or it's not so microscopic that it doesn't address all people. It's only some people. As a coach or a trainer, you want to make sure that you're able to have varied input. It's a dynamic system that allows you to go in an organized manner, but you can get consistent results depending, regardless of who you're working with. And as an athlete or fitness enthusiast, you want the best opportunity for yourself. Okay. So that being said, what we do is we talk about, there's equipment, position, and action. Equipment right now, we're just going to talk about a typical bench press using a bar. So positioning, we're going to go through stance, grip, the body bar relationship, and tension. That's what we're going to talk about as a setup. And then from an action standpoint, we're going to be specifically looking at the bench press. But with the bench press, there's a lot of different components to it. We'll get to some of that. So positioning. Positioning is your setup. This is where we're going to get into how do I need to be, what needs to happen in my body relative to the bench and the bar, specifically for the bench press, because this is where we're going to create balance, stability, and leverage. In order to do any lift, we need to be balanced. It means we have to have proper distribution of weight relative to the weight that we're using, etc. And we need to make sure and ensure that our body is in a stable position and has the ability to be stable, so that we are able to produce maximal leverage to lift the loads that we desire to lift. You do not have to, if you're on this call and you're not concerned about how to lift as heavy as possible, that's okay. It's still having appropriate techniques and being able to train to set your body up and to be able to train more appropriately for what you're going to be doing. So again, we're going to talk about stance, grip, body bar relationship, and that's the relationship between you and the bar, and then the tension that we're going to need to create. And let's go through and just talk about each one. And this again is be specific to the bench press. So starting with stance. The bench presses, you actually don't, before we even get to that, let me throw one more poll out for you guys. This is just for kind of a little bit of a brain teaser. So the poll is, the bench press is what type of exercise? Body, upper body, lower body, or total body? Awesome. Okay, I got a lot of switched on people on this call. I love it. You guys are rock stars. So the answer is total body. It is an upper body dominant, or emphasized, I should say, but it is a total body exercise. So when we talk about the stance, just getting into our stance for the bench press, it's unique in that we have basically 5 points of contact versus a deadlift or a squat, which we have 2 primary points of contact, which is our feet. So in the bench press, we have our feet, both feet, we have our glutes, we have our shoulder, mid-back area, and we have the head. So all of those are contact points that enable us to have pressure against the bench, as well as creating the stability and the balance, so we're not wavering as we lift the load. Because even though it's a bar, that bar still has the ability to move, and every little move that bar may make, hopefully it's not too much, but every little move that bar makes, our body has to be able to compensate for that. It has to be able to address it so we don't tip or fall over. So that's just in a very general standpoint. So, however, to get in this position, when we have our feet and we have our glutes and we have our shoulders and that, the low back is going to arch. So what I want to know from you is it okay for the low back to arch? Yes or no? Is that okay for people to have an arch in their low back? Beautiful. Okay. You guys are rock stars. Thanks. Yes. And the answer to that is very simplistically yes. And biomechanically, that makes sense. And we're going to talk about why, because this is one of the misconceptions, and this is much more predominant in the fitness industry in general, is you should never arch your low back. But that's actually technically incorrect. And if that's something that you've been taught, Unfortunately, you have not been taught biomechanically correct principles because your spine and your back are meant to flex and extend, rotate and laterally flex. It's meant to do that. We say don't do that because we're afraid someone's going to get hurt. And yes, you can get hurt. So the answer is yes, but it depends on the person. And so that's why we go through stance, grip, body bar relationship, and tensioning to make sure that we're able to address the person, and why we're going to talk about movement assessments. Okay. So yes, it can. And this is based upon a concept that's called biotensegrity. So I don't know how many of you have heard of the concept biotensegrity. If you've never heard of the concept of biotensegrity, then what we're going to do is we're going to kind of talk about that real quick. So biotensegrity is basically a term that refers to bio meaning the body, and then tensegrity is tension creates integrity. So the tension in our system, in our bodies, creates integrity, which is stability. So this is why the ability to understand what tension means and what tension is vital to any form of lifting, whether it's powerlifting, whether it's weightlifting, whether it's just functional training, CrossFit-esque training. If we don't know how to generate tension, then we're losing out on the body's ability to stabilize itself or enhance its stability component. That's one component of it. We'll talk about something else later. So when we talk about tension and how the body creates tension, you'll see in that lower picture, you see all those wooden poles. This is a really big, it's basically a piece of art almost, and it's big. It's actually, if you had a person standing there, they would only be about a third of the way up, maybe halfway up max. But all of those wooden poles are not touching. They're all separated, and the only thing that's connecting them is the wires, which creates tension. So the tension on the wires is actually pushing against the wood, which can't be compressed, so it actually creates a non-compressible unit, which anything you push into is going to push back against you. It's called action-reaction. It's one of the laws of motion. So as the tension is created, those poles become very stable, and that's how you can create this arch. Well, that arch, by the way, is exactly what the spine will do in a bench press if we set up and create proper tensioning, and if we know our movement capacity, which is why we should do some form of movement assessments. And what it looks like in the human body is this is a skeleton. Those bones are just like those wooden poles. That myofascial strip that you see on the side right there. So if you guys can see, there's this myofascial, so there's neck muscles, there's all the muscles of the trunk, the hip, the lateral hip, down through the lateral thigh, and down through the lateral leg to the bottom of the foot. So from toes to nose, we have myofascial tissue. And I say myofascial because it's not just muscle, it's all the fascial tissue that's connected to it, all the tendons, all the ligaments, all of that is all one seamless unit of tissue. We always see muscle as separate from our connective tissue, and that's completely false. Having been blessed with being able to go through a number of dissections, when you open up a cadaver and you see the body, it is totally different than what you would see in a textbook or what you're told. So Thomas Myers is actually the person who created these myofascial, they're basically got myofascial train. And he calls them trains because they're all connected. It's just this one big connected tissue. He was the first person to actually start cutting the body and dissecting all of the tissue out at the same time, not just cutting or pulling away all of the connective tissue and looking at muscle. So we now know from the late 90s on, and even before that, we knew this, it just never really taught in the industry, that all of this tissue is attached to the bones, and as that tissue is able to contract and able to create tension, it's pressing on the bones, it's pressing on the organs, it's pressing on every component of the body, which then resists that, and that action-reaction is what creates tension in the body and can enhance stability. So a very simplistic answer of a very complicated but simplistic principle in the body. So here's just a quick look at various lines that are from Thomas Meyer's books, Anatomy Trains. So if you've ever seen or heard of the book Anatomy Trains, if you haven't, I highly recommend that you go read it, especially if you're a coach or an athlete, a coach or a strength coach or a personal trainer. You definitely want to understand this concept. And if you're an athlete or enthusiast who's on this call and you're looking for more information, Anatomy Trains by Thomas Myers is a fantastic book. So all of these lines exist. Now, in reality, all of them are connected. They're not separated. They're all connected, but this is just to give you an example. Okay, so now that we understand from the stance that we have these 5 points of contact, finding how that works for us is going to be vital for our bench press performance. So the way that we can find the optimal stance, setup position for ourselves or those who we're working with can be found with a combination of mobility assessments. And we're going to look at some simple integrated and isolated mobility assessments. And that's going to be mixed with ultimately the feel and the preference of the lifter, the person you're lifting with. Feel and preference is vital when you're doing lifting because there is no one position that everyone has to be in because we all have different body types. We have different limb lengths. We have different ratios of our limb lengths, and that dramatically can impact. When I say dramatic, it's just little tiny changes means that you can have a distinct change in how the positioning and the setup will be for certain people. And anyone who's ever seen a variety of people lift, especially if you've been to a competition, you can see that there's a similarity in the positioning, but there's variations in everybody. Extremely important. So let's go through some mobility assessments. Let's start with some integrated ones because this will help when we take the integrated and the isolated mobility assessments, we get an overall picture of what the lifter, you, or the person you're working with is capable of positioning themselves in. And that helps give us information. This is how we create safety. This is how we take exercise and we start to make it much more reproducible, but safe because we want to prevent injury. So the simple one to do is just a bridge. And here you see Patrick, this is our tactical training manager, in a bridge position. So on the end of the bench, you can have them just get to where they can lift their hips up. So you just want to see what is their ability to lift their hips up, not going into parallel, but can they actually get above parallel with the hips? And how does that feel for them? Everyone's going to be at a different positioning. And you can even take his feet, you see they're more of a perpendicular to the floor. You can even pull those back a little bit like you see mine in the top one to get a better indication because that'll show you a little bit more of their ability to dorsiflex, their a little bit more ability of their knee to flex in that position as they're going into hip extension, which is distinctly different. But a bridge is a great simple mobility assessment that you can use. Okay, and again, we just want to look to see where their hip extension is with the feet flat. Some isolated assessments that we can do for their stance is we want to look at the retraction of their shoulders. And so in that one, the top one, you see that I start with my hand, my shoulders protracted, and all I want to do is can I retract my shoulders? And when I retract my shoulders, do they come straight back and not up? So I want to see, can I get both shoulder blades to come back? That's important because when you get on that bench, you want to get those shoulders back and down because that helps create a platform where your shoulders are on the bench, and that helps to lift the chest a little bit, which creates some biomechanical advantage for you, which can take pressure off the shoulders and create a little bit stronger bench if that's what you're looking for. We also have an isolated hip extension with a bent knee. So you take a bent knee, make sure that they have that knee flexed at least at 90 or even above that, because that'll take the hamstring out of that loop, and it's just working on kind of a more glute dominant hip extension capacity. And then also dorsiflexion. Dorsiflexion, you can just sit in a chair, just sit tall, feet flat, and just lift the toes up. Can they bring their toes up, and how far can they lift that foot up once they're seated? Because if they can barely get it off, it means they don't have very good dorsiflexion. Okay? All right, so if they have good isolated assessments here, then that means that their stance may be able to be modified in a few different ways to best accommodate what feels good to them. If they don't have real good mobility in these areas and it's a little poor, then their stance is going to be very reduced, and or the arch may even cause discomfort for them. So that's going to affect where they're going to position their feet and how much arch they're going to have. This is important to know because you don't want people arching their back who don't have good hip extension whatsoever. And you don't want people trying to get their feet way back if they don't have any dorsiflexion. Now, if you're a competitor and you're trying to compete, mobility will be your limiting factor. And there's so much more to that statement that I just said. But as a precursor, our next two webinars in June and July are both going to be centered around mobility and how to use it, how to understand it, and how to make sure you know that to prevent injury. Because a lot of the stuff that we do out there right now for mobility isn't neurophysiologically proper. And we'll talk about that and other things. Okay, so good means you have variety. If you don't have it, then you have to go with what the person can do at that particular time, and then know that mobility has to be addressed. Okay, so this is just going to give us an overall picture of what they have. Remember, it's going to come down to feel and preference. If you're a coach or a trainer, you have to use their feel and preference as a massive indicator of what you're going to do with them, because they're telling you what their body's telling them. So I know one of the things that happens in powerlifting, weightlifting, and any training is a lot of times we just get stuck in, well, there's one way to do this. And it's not one way, it's not one position, and there's not even one best action, as we'll talk about later on. There's a variety of things can happen, and it's going to be based upon their anatomy, their physiology, not what somebody says or what someone on Instagram tells you. It's not that. It's going to be them, and you have to use your coach's eye. So the more information, the more you understand about how the body works, the better you're going to be able to coach. As an athlete, if you understand this, then you can start to gauge, or a fitness enthusiast, why certain things feel better and certain things don't. And you want to go with what your body's kind of telling you, not what you saw on a video or on a podcast. Okay, I just want to make that very clear. You got to use yourself and or your client. Okay, let's talk about the grip. Grip's going to be the same thing, and now we're talking about, are we going to go narrow or wide, and what's the extension capacity of our wrist, and where should that be relative to who we are and what we're trying to accomplish. We're going to use some assessments. So let's get into the mobility assessments from an integrated standpoint. We have three powerful ones. All three of these work great together, and it does not take long to do this. Push-up, going a narrow grip, because that's another thing. When it comes to grip, there's so many people say, oh, you got to go wide because it's you don't have as far to go. Wide and narrow has nothing to do with making it easier or harder for someone, because narrow is different, uses the musculature differently than narrow grip. So if you're not strong out here and you're starting to just blow this up and try to use a lot of weight, you're going to end up crushing your shoulders. So it's not that one is better. Look at Julius Maddox, who's the world champion raw bench presser. He uses more of a narrow grip, and even when he teaches it, he says you should be in more of a push-up stance here. That's what he feels. So it doesn't matter what grip you use, it's what can you use? What's going to work for you, especially at where you're at right now. So narrow push-up or wide push-up, which one feels better to you or the person you're working with? Because they may go narrow and it's like, oh man, that feels great. When they get wide, it's like, ooh, that's hard. So you know right away, it's not that they can't progress to something different. It means to start them out in a safe zone for what their body's capable of doing right now. That's where it might be most beneficial. The one-arm plank shows you the stability of the shoulder. So if I'm doing a one-arm plank, I go down and lift my arm up. Can I hold that? And when I do that, am I doing the same from both sides? And you're not just looking at the shoulder, you're looking at what happens to the trunk. If they lift that arm up and all of a sudden that trunk twists, that means that they don't have trunk stability. And do not fool yourself, trunk stability is vitally important for a bench press, because your trunk has to stabilize and keep the body from rotating to maintain stability in the shoulders so the bar doesn't move so you can get a successful lift. Okay. The Davies test is a little more unique because now it's dynamic. You're about 36 inches wide. You'll see there's 2 pieces of tape down there. And what you do is you go as many touches as you can in 15 seconds back and forth. That's seeing how dynamically stable are you in that particular position. And that's actually a shoulder test that's used to see if people have rehab properly, or if you have proper stability or adequate stability in your shoulder joint. That's an actual rehab test. And it's fun to do if you enjoy a challenge, but it'll tell you right away. And again, it's not just are you able to touch and go back and forth and all that. It's what's happening to the whole body. Is every time you see someone go one way, that whole body twists. It means that they don't necessarily have good total body or trunk stability, which we call core, which is going to affect shoulder. Poor core stability will affect your shoulders in the bench press, just so you know. Okay? So those are some, and that's going to help potentially determine whether someone may be able to either do narrow or wider grip, or if someone's going to have to just stick with narrow, or they just feel much more comfortable wide. So that's how you can kind of find some grip assessment ability. Also, you want to find out the shoulder from an isolated standpoint is what's their shoulder horizontal abduction. So if you retract your shoulder blades and you keep your shoulder blade from moving, and you just bring your humerus or your arm across your body with internal rotation, that's showing you how much adduction you have in your shoulder, which is extremely important because that's one of the things that you're going to be doing when you press. Also extension, how much extension you have. Don't forget, when you're coming on a bench and you have to come down, you have to extend. And if you're competing, you have to make sure that your elbow extends below your shoulder joint. If not, I suggest people, I'm a huge fan of train full range of motion, don't train partial ranges of motion. It's not that you can't use partial ranges of motion to strengthen certain ranges, but make sure your body and your joints have the ability to go through a full range of motion. And if you don't have that, you can train it. And that's what the next 2 webinars will be about as well. Okay, so extension. And then the other one is extension with external rotation, because you have to have external rotation, especially if you go wide, you have to have really good external rotation in your shoulder joint. So if someone is really struggling to get external rotation with extension, then that's not the person who's going to go wide and do a lot of bench pressing, because they're already in the hole. So these are some things that you can use. And again, all of this information with videos and tutorials and all that stuff is in our online course. All right. So if they're good with these, their hand position kind of go wherever they feel most comfortable. If they're poor, they're probably going to have to stay a little bit closer than wider for most people. General rule of thumb. Body bar relationship. This is about where the bar is relative to you. Anytime we lift, I always call it a dance. Olympic weightlifting is a little bit more of a dance than powerlifting is, but you still have to dance with the bar, because you have to make sure you're in the right position and the bar is in the right position and that bar stays in the right position in order for you to accomplish what you're trying to accomplish. Because if you're dancing, you don't want to step on your partner's toes. And the last thing you want to do is the bar to step on you. Okay, so again, we want to create from this, we want to create balanced position so we can have a successful lift. So there's a few things that we can look at from body bar relationship. First, what we just talked about. What is your grip style? You're going to be narrow or wide? Which one is that going to be? Because that's going to change, obviously, the relationship you're going to have with the bar. Then the proper rack height. When you're lifting the bar off, and this is a little bit more for competition, but if you're training by yourself, like a lot of times I train by myself. So this is vitally important for me because I want to make sure that it's not a struggle for me to get the bar on and off the rack. So as a general rule of thumb, if you're looking at, and when I say general rule of thumb, that means it can vary. And for a lot of people, it will vary. So I'm not giving you an absolute. The general rule of thumb is to have the J cups at about wrist height. So you can see when I say the J cup, that's the hook that's holding the bar, for those of you that may not know what the J cup is. And so the bar is resting on top of that J cup. And that means that the top of that J cup where the bar is going to sit, or where the bar is located, should be right about your wrist, as you see in the picture right there. That's a general rule of thumb, and you want to do that so it's not too difficult to press. You don't have to start real low and press the bar off. And when you set it back in its extended position, you can just go back. You don't have to then go back and down. If it's too high, then you've got to move your whole body to get it off. And then if you're going to re-rack it, you got to get up and over the J cup. So that's just a general rule of thumb to keep it simple and safe, because we always want to make sure we're training as safe as we possibly can. Now, the body bar placement in the rack, when you get set up and you're in, you have all your contact points, you get situated, the bar should be, in general, rule of thumb again, basically over the eyes. So you should be looking up and the bar should be right over the bridge of your nose, eyebrows, eyeballs, right in that area. So when you lift it off, it's going to be basically over the chest in some areas. Some people it's a little bit lower, some people it's a little bit higher. But you want to make sure that it moves away from those J cups, so as you come down and back up, you don't hit that J cup. You don't hit the rack, because that's not safe. So that's a general rule of thumb for you. All right. Tension. This is potentially one of the most important aspects of any lift, and with the bench press more so. And this is how the bench press becomes a total body exercise, not just an upper body exercise. So we want to look at a few different things. So number one, when you're in your position, you want to drive through the feet. So you're pressing the feet into the floor. And by pushing the feet into the floor, you're actually activating the myofascial lines up through the front as well as the back itself. So we push through, that should come through hip extension. So that should activate the glute, but that also means that you're getting activation in the anterior shin component as well as the posterior. So you're kind of getting shin and calf tension. You're also getting quad tension. And that quad is vital because those quads, as we saw in one of the lines, the myofascial lines, they attach right into the abdominal complex, which attaches right into the pectoral complex. So everything's connected. So when we push through, we immediately start getting the feet engaged, active feet, lower legs, upper legs, hips, and that sets up a good bridge potentially. And with the glutes activated, that helps to stabilize the low back. All right. And then the second component we can look at is engaging the head and mid back and shoulders. So when we get the shoulders in that retracted position, and when I say retracted, that's in the setup. As you press the bar, you don't want to keep them retracted. Let them unretract and protract, because that uses proper musculature, and it saves the shoulder joint from so much strain and stress, because the shoulder has to move with the arm and the shoulder blade together to maintain proper stability in the shoulder joint itself. If you retract and hold that shoulder blade there and you're only moving the arm, you're not allowing the rotator cuff muscles to move dynamically to stabilize that joint through its full range of motion. So that's just a very simple statement. That's a whole presentation in and of itself. But when we get those shoulders back and down, and we engage that, and you press the head and the shoulders into the bench, that creates posterior engagement, engages through the lats. Your lats are connected to your glutes, and that creates stabilization of your low back and your SI joints. And that's vitally important for the whole posterior and anterior component to now be tensed. You're not tensing it so you're trying to crush your bones. You're just creating tension so the body senses stability. And then the final one is the bracing component. So we've got the lower body, the upper body. Now we want to make sure internally in the trunk we have good intra-abdominal pressure. And so the bracing comes in here. Bracing in the course, we have a full video that goes through it, but simply bracing has basically three components. There's a deep stabilizing mechanism that we can utilize that stabilizes your pelvis on the spine. That's extremely important to support your low back. That's extremely important to make sure that you have good pelvic stabilization, because that's the deep internal stabilizers. That's going to stabilize your spine. This is what's going to help keep people from having an injured back. That's by doing a Kegel maneuver. If you don't know what that is, just pretend like you're going to the bathroom, you have to stop. That maneuver that you just did to stop yourself from going to the bathroom, that's a deep internal stabilizing mechanism. So that's number one. Number two is then you're going to take, they're kind of together. You have the bracing and you have the Valsalva maneuver. Those three components are the bracing component. That's all what you'd want to do bracing. Number one, deep internal. Stop yourself from going to the bathroom. Boom. That's deep. That should be lower. The brace itself, and I've seen so many videos when people say, when you brace, you want to hunker down. You want to. If you're doing that, you're flexing your spine. You're flexing your whole mid back and your back. You don't want to flex down. You want to compress down. So when you brace, it's here, not here. Okay? That's biomechanically correct. There are biomechanically principles that people should be doing. So don't be flexing down. You want to cinch the whole body. You're trying to squeeze down this way, not forward. And that's done as you inhale. So it's inhale. And as you get that breath inside you, you fill up the lungs, the diaphragm goes down. That actually forces the pressure, the inner abdominal pressure, into a compact place. Then when you brace, it pushes it against the spine. That's how you stabilize your spine. So I'll give you a little bit more detail. But again, that's all in the course. We'll go through it, and it's a video to show you. Then if you use a belt, it's a little bit, it's the same thing, but the one thing, if you're using a belt with this, which is fine, make sure that you do your deep stabilization mechanism first, then put the belt on to where it's not as tight as possible, because people put it on super tight, but then you can't get a good deep breath. If you can't get a good deep breath, you can't get enough air in, so you're actually losing one of the vital components of your bracing mechanism. Put the belt on, make it snug, but to where you can still inhale, because you want to inhale, and then the belt is there to hold it. It's not there to constrict you, if that makes sense, okay? And again, we talk about that, of course. All right, so that's our bracing. So that's the whole setup process. That is our positioning. So again, in review, you want to make sure that we have flat feet, knees are bent, we got our glutes down, there's an arch in the back, head and shoulders are down on the bench. Use your mobility assessments and feel-in preference as a guide as to what that looks like. Your grip, find the hand width and the wrist angle. Just as a quick, you don't want the wrist completely bent, and you certainly don't want it straight, because if the bar is in a straight, it's gonna want to fall forward. So there's a slight extension, so the bar has a shelf to rest in. I strongly urge a full grip. I know you'll see a lot of heroes do it with the thumbs under, but I strongly urge a full grip, especially if you're coaching somebody. Safety first, all right? Body bar relationship, we talked about that, where the bar is in the rack and where it is when you take it out. And then we're gonna go through the tension. We just walked through all the tension. Make sure that you got your feet to activate the quads and glutes. You got the head and shoulders engaged to activate posterior, got good stability, and then brace. You're gonna hollow Valsalva brace, okay? Avoid flexing the spine. Okay. Now, finishing up. The action's pretty simple, but it can be kind of complicated. There's basically two things. We're gonna lower it, we're gonna raise the bar back up. That's what we do. We wanna make sure we maintain positioning that we just did. Everything stays the same, all we're doing is gonna lower. Now, when we lower, we wanna do a few things. Now, and again, I'm gonna say this is a way, this is not the only way, and I'll preface that at the end. Proper technique, a lot of times we'll do a J curve. So a lot of people will start up in here, and they'll kind of curve it down as you see that yellow line to about where this bar is on my shirt, just below that, right about where the pec and the ribs meet, kind of your sternal line right there. And that's how it curves downward and sit. And as that curves downward, one thing that works very well for a lot of people is as you're coming down, to avoid the shoulder height that a lot of people can get, which is kind of biomechanically the opposite of what you want to happen, you bring those the elbows are going to kind of start coming or winding the shoulder down towards the side as you get in here. And that's because you want to bring those shoulders back and down and get that set right here. So you're actually kind of winding those shoulders or elbows and bringing them back and down as you get into that position with the bar coming towards the chest. Now to raise it, you're going to unwind that. So you can see that the elbows start here, but as the bar starts to come up, there's kind of a couple ways that people do this. They'll use the same J curve and just go back up the same way. So they'll come down towards the chest and then go back up towards more the neck area or so. And that's one way. And as you do that, the elbows will kind of flare out because that starts to bring in the mechanical advantage of how the pecs work. So boom, 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 and I'm out here. There's also a reverse or an inverted J where some people will move it forward and then come up. There's variations of that. So those are two different ways that we can bring the bar back up to the original position. And as a note, there are people who will just come straight down and come straight up. It's going to depend on your body, what feels best for you. If you're new and you've never tried some of these, give them a shot and see if one of them feels a little bit better for you. Okay, I've tried both of these, and I have also tried vertical. The one on the left, just the regular kind of curvature, that one for me works best, but that's only me. That doesn't mean anything for you. Okay, so simplistically, unrack the bar, get your body position. You're going to descend with the bar, and then you're going to ascend and bring that bar back up, making sure that the elbows are doing what they're supposed to do relative to where you have them positioned, just so the shoulders aren't hiking up as you're lifting. Keep that head and shoulders on the bench and let the shoulders protract as you go into pressing, because that again stabilizes the shoulder joint. Okay, and that's a simple how to get a better bench press using your technique without the programming. So the next strength talk that we'll be doing will be June 19th, and that's going to be maximize your training results. So it's going to be a two-part series on how to maximize your training results. The first one's going to be the role of recovery. What is it? How does it work? And what are we recovering from? And what do we need to do to maximize that? The second one will be July 11th, and that's going to be looking at how to prevent and overcome injury. That one's vital for what most people need to do this day. And again, there's a code there that you guys get a 25% discount on any of our online education. So download that. That's either in the materials chart or in the handouts, depending on which version of GoTo that you have. Okay, that being said, are there any questions? Feel free to ask any questions. I have one that says true false. Bench pressing takes away from Olympic lifts. No. Bench pressing won't take away from Olympic lifts if you're an Olympic lifter just because you bench press. It's, are you bench pressing and do you have proper mobility? Are you addressing your tissues so that they're able to move the way they're supposed to? As a precursor to a lot of things, mobility is the limiting factor, but mobility doesn't mean that you have to yank on things, stretch things, pull things, rip things. That's not how the body wants to work. That's not how it responds, and that's not how it will. It's making sure that you're able to activate the tissue on demand at the right time, at the right speeds. And so we'll talk about that later. So no, that won't affect if you're training your body properly. Okay, do you recommend a complete elbow lockout at the end of the movement? That's a great question. Number one, is the person, can they do that because of any type of situation, personal issue, injury, or anything? So all things being equal and all things good, I recommend the elbows to lock out because people can get into a full position. You want to train full positions. So where people get lost is, well, I don't want to lock out with a heavy weight. If you can push that weight and you can't get your arm straight and hold that weight, it's because you didn't train that all the way up to there. Your body will respond to those. And your joint, remember, in a locked out position, your joint should be, that's the easiest position for the joint, is in a locked out position. This is a much harder position for the joint because it places so much more stress on the tissue. But if you've never trained that in any of the other lighter lifts or the months, weeks, years prior to what you're doing, then no, because your body's not capable of doing that. Don't try to do it on the heaviest load. Do it all the time. And I'm a huge fan of in range of motion. And the lockout isn't the problem. It's who's doing it, when are they doing it, and what have they done to prepare for it. That's going to always be the problem. And I hope that helped, Luan. Can you please explain again the grip width? Okay, grip width is either, and as a general question, I'll probably give a general answer. So there's narrow gripping or there's wide gripping. Now, depending on competition, you can only go so wide, but some people will go really wide. The wider you go, the more stress you place on the shoulder, in simplicity. The more narrow you go, the more stress you're going to be placing on the tricep component. So this is much more chest shoulder. This is much more tricep chest kind of pressing. So some people are better closer, some people are better wider. I'm a better closer bench presser just because of my arm lengths and my comfort zone. I train better when I'm in closer, but I can go out wider. It's just I don't like that, it just doesn't feel good to me. That's all. So that's the only major difference, and that's going to depend again on what's the person's mobility, what kind of internal external rotation, what kind of extension external rotation do they have. All of those things will play into the grip width. So I hope that helped, Linda. Are these slides available? No, these slides aren't available for download, but they are in the course, and the course has all of this and more. So sorry for that. Is it undesired for glutes to come off the bench during push the bar up? Any advice on how? Okay, so if you're competing, they can't come off, especially if you're competing in the IPF sanctioned meets. So in IPF, your glutes have to stay on. If you're not worried about it, I'm going to leave that kind of up to the person. But from a mechanical standpoint, it's not necessary to have your glutes come off the bench because you're really putting a lot more extension on the body. So if that's not something that you can do and you're strengthened to do that with load, then I would suggest not. If you're coaching, I definitely wouldn't have my clients do that at all. I coach for safety first in all clients because most clients are going to try to do that. And if you're competing, like I said, in IPF, you can't do it anyway. Good questions. Are shoes vital for bench? They can be. So I see many teams lift without shoes. A few times I've suggested they should lift with shoes. The shoe comes into play more if you're trying to compete. And a lot of times if there's a lift in the shoe, that's because the person doesn't have good dorsiflexion, and that lift allows them to get their feet back farther so they can get a little bit more tension built up in their arch. So that's where the shoe can be beneficial if you're competing. If you're training barefoot, or you train in a minimalist shoe, but you have the ability to get back, then that's okay. So I'll kind of leave it at that. That's a great question. And if you suggest people to wear shoes, it depends on the policy of the club. So if club want people wearing shoes, then they definitely should have shoes on. If the club doesn't care about shoes or the facility they're training in, then that becomes a personal preference. I know some people are all into barefoot training, and there's nothing wrong with that, but it just depends on, again, where they're training and what they're trying to accomplish, what they're capable of doing. Value in using the slingshot, the armband thing. So here's my take on all the cool tools that are out there. All of them can work, but not all of them will work for everybody. So again, is it something that is helpful? And with all of these tools that can be used out there, is your body capable of handling any stress that that's going to be putting on you? So that's one of the things that we overlook, and most people who develop these things don't ever talk about, rarely, is if you're going to do something like a slingshot, are you capable of handling that yourself? Is your body prepared, or are you just starting out and away you go? So always find out what it's going to do. Anything you use, make sure you're using a lightweight so you understand how it works and moves. So you're not throwing something brand new to your body that it's never done, because that increases your chance for injury. So anything can work, doesn't mean it will work, especially for everybody. Good question. For competitive bench pressers, is there a benefit to including both pause and touch and go pressing into your training? Absolutely. Or should there be a focus on either? It comes down to what's your strength and what's your weaknesses. So obviously in competition, you have to pause. So can you pause? So get used to pausing and lifting, and then where are you having a struggle? Some people are great off the chest, and then from there they suck. Some people can't get it off the chest, but once they get it off the chest, then they're great. So you have to figure out where's the weak spot, and that will determine what you need to focus on. If you're pretty good at both, then it doesn't matter. You can pick a variety of them. So it's good to get the body to do things different, especially if you're going to compete. So you're training all aspects or all points within that lift. Good question. Weight belts are only supposed to be used when loading the spine vertically. So would the bench press exercise apply? Yes, and just so you know, weight belts aren't necessarily only supposed to be used when loading vertically. I don't know who said that, but that's what a weight belt should be doing is enhancing the intra-abdominal pressure, not constricting anything. So you have intra-abdominal pressure whether you're lying on your back, whether you're lying on your stomach, whether you're lying on your side, whether you're standing, whether you're kneeling. You're always going to have intra-abdominal pressure. So all the belt should do is help enhance that as it creates a third layer. So it's like you have your deep tissue, you have your superficial tissue, and you have your belt, which is superficial to that. Those should all help to create a wall, a three-layered wall that makes the air stay in and the pressure stay in your abdominal to push up against the spine so it doesn't come out forward. That's what a belt does. So that's a good question. Yes, it can be used. You don't have to. You don't have to wear a belt. I don't wear a belt, but I don't lift maximal lifts anymore. So I'm not trying to see how strong I can get. But I used to wear a belt when I was training heavy. Larson press as an accessory for the bench. So again, this will go back into variations of presses, equipment used for the press. They can all be beneficial. It comes back to who are you, what are you capable of doing, and how do you feel, and what does that do for you? And those of you that have done some of the things, you may think, I didn't like it. So either your body's like, don't do that because I don't really like that, or there's something else that you need to learn how to do with that in order to make it more beneficial. So I'm not against anything. It's just who's doing it, why are you doing it, and are you capable of doing it? Those are my 3 checkpoints. What are your thoughts on the bench press variations? Incline, decline, do them all. Do them all. It depends on what phase of training you're at. So there should be different phases. You should have a base phase. You should have more of a build phase, and you should have more of a peaking phase, depending on how you're training. It doesn't matter if you're just a fitness enthusiast or a competitor. They should be these phases. Base phases use different forms of equipment. So do different incline, decline, and not just incline, decline, and flat, but do shoulder press. Shoulder press is massive. Do it with dumbbells, do it with kettlebells, do it with barbells, do it with landmines, do it with cable. Use all these variations in a base phase. As you get into the build phase, you start honing in on a little bit more load, and you want to hone in a little bit more on if you're going to compete using those things. using the barbell basically. And then the peak, that's where you're going to really focus on more maximal type lifting. So yes, I think all variations should be used because you want to train the body in totality. Because if you're only training one thing all the time, then you're going to lose the ability to do the other things because the body will just throw out what it doesn't need and what's not being used, and it'll focus on that, and that's where we get injury, overuse injury, and a lot of not good things happen. Good question, Fleet. Okay. I know it's 11 o'clock right now. I'll try to answer the rest of the questions. If you have to go, feel free. This will be recorded, so if you missed the end and you want to hear some of the questions and you can't stay, go ahead. But I'll stay here and answer a few more questions. Does bench height and leg length affect the force generated in the lift? If so, one, use wedges or blocks to elevate feet. Yes. So your leg length, your ability to position the legs is going to affect how much force you can generate from the feet up through the body. So in competition, they let you use blocks depending on where you can touch and what size your legs are. So yes, feel free to do that so you can actually maximize that because benches are only set at one height. So they don't adjust up and down to accommodate everyone's body types. So yes, that can make a difference and that can be very helpful. Great question, Evan. Linda, you're very welcome. Is it good to do negative reps, eccentric only with heavy weight that you can press? Yeah, absolutely. So just realize, so yes, concentric only, concentric, eccentric, isometric, that all works. It's all beneficial. And I'm a big fan of that, especially if you're trying to create adaptation, you're trying to get bigger, better, stronger, whatever it is that you're trying to do. Just know that when you do the eccentric and you're doing a heavy eccentric, that is the most tissue tearing component. So that's the most injurious to the body. That's not a bad thing, but if you don't recover differently from that, then you do other training, then that's where you can get into trouble and start creating an overuse. And we'll get into that a little bit more on the two-part series that's coming up in the webinars. Yes, great question. As someone with long legs, 34-inch, would it make sense to elevate the bench in an attempt to improve leg drive and help keep my butt in contact with the bench? Yes, you can. You can. If you're not, yeah, because I know there are some benches that do elevate, and there are some things. So you can, if you want to do that, absolutely. It's not going to hurt. Just make sure that it's appropriate and you're not getting too much of an arch for what you're capable of doing. That's all. But yes, you can absolutely do that, Mika. Wrist straps. Wrist straps have definite pros. Everything has pros and cons. So wrist straps can have pros. And if you're saying, a wrist wrap. So the wrist wraps can be very beneficial. You'll see a lot of powerlifters use that. It can actually help support the wrist. One of the things, and there's actually an article, so in the download that I have for you guys, if you download that, there's free resources on our website, the education page. So if you go to our website, go on to the education page, scroll down, there's free resources. One of the articles is on wrist wraps and the benefits of wrist wraps. But in essence, remember, as your wrist goes, so does the arm. So if your wrist is able to control and have better stabilization, then it's going to help stabilize the shoulder as well. And it helps stabilize the grip. So the grip and the shoulder are all affected because of the way the myofascial lines work. So they can be beneficial. Where the cons come in is someone always wears them. They never just train their grip and they never train the wrist for stability. That's where the con kind of comes in. So use them, but also train lighter loads and train without them at times so you're not reliant upon everything. So your body knows that it still has to have stability on its own without outside help. All of those always work better when you have good strength yourself, because then it augments it without taking away from it. Great question. What kind of auxiliary exercise do you recommend to improve bench press? So that's a loaded question. It's a great question. So first off, you need to have trunk stability. You need to have shoulder stability. So we always think of exercise, but making sure that I have good rotator cuff activation. That's where we've just launched a readiness and recovery training online course as well that you guys will see if you go on the site. And it goes through how to assess shoulder mobility and then how to activate to help enhance that mobility. So your trunk and your shoulder joints are vitally important to actually having more, because you can do all kinds of exercises, but if you're losing the capacity of your trunk to stabilize you and your shoulder joint to have dynamic stability, then all that's going to do is hurt you more than it's going to help you. But any of those exercises, making sure that you have good delt activation, front, mid, and rear, the delts, traps can be very helpful. Lower traps are something that's usually not worked on a whole lot, and that's either going through depressions or going through some type of scaption exercise. You know, all your lateral raises and shoulder presses and Arnold presses and all can be awesome. So, but you want to make sure that you're doing torso. I have especially in a base phase, allow people to do things in a standing position as well, because that helps you get your trunk and your legs, your lower body and upper body working together. So it's not just prone. Doing things on a bench, but you're not lying on the bench. You just have your head and shoulders on the bench. You're off, or you're kind of counter, just one side of your body's on the bench, so the other side's a little free. There's nuances that you can do to help train the body to make sure that it's getting the ability to accept and receive load, but be stable while doing that. So all things work. Lats, rhomboids, so all the rows, all the pulling motions can definitely benefit, because you have to be able to get into these positions anyway and have strength through the back as well as through the front. So very general question, but in essence, stability of the trunk and shoulders first, and then all the other exercises that you want to do, they're going to be fine. Pull downs, rows, all that stuff, shoulder presses, lateral raises, front raises, definitely work good. What's your number one additional accessory movement to accompany bench press cycle that will help improve on bench? That's a great question, Christopher, because it's going to depend on the person. So there is no one best exercise that everyone should do. It's going to be, what does somebody actually need? That's going to be the best one. So again, it just goes back to what I just said. Do they have good trunk and shoulder stability? Because if you're trying to bench and you don't have that, then you're wasting your time. So make sure that you have foundation, so then you can put load on a foundation. You put load on no foundation, you're just going to break the foundation. So that's where it becomes, I think, one exercise taken away if someone has good stability. One exercise I think people don't do a lot is they don't do a lot of shoulder pressing. They don't do a lot of overhead pressing. And so I think that would be very beneficial for some people to add in. But do not forget pulling exercises. Do not forget the pulling exercises, because that helps balance out the system as well. Okay. Yeah, soft touch or sinking bench press. That's a feel. So some people, the question is it a soft touch to where you're just coming down and touching the chest lightly and kind of holding the bar with tension and then going up? Or do you sink in and you're hoping that there's a slight rebound, and then competition, as long as it's not bouncing, then that can be okay. That's really preference. That's going to come down to what can you do, what feels best to you. Great question. Wrist wraps, we already talked about. When to use them, we already talked about that one. That's a good question. When will you send out the recording of this webinar? This webinar will be out in probably about 1 hour after we shut down. In about an hour, you should get a message that says that you got something. Thank you for the kind words. How the elbow should be positioned during the bench press. Does it stay at the same degree through the full range? No. So again, the elbows, if you can see from here, and my elbows are out, but as I come down, my elbows are coming down towards my hip like this. And then I'm in this position. And then when I push up, then they start to flare back out to be biomechanically correct for the chest. So there's kind of a wind them up and then unwind them and push them out. Good question, Daniel. On pin press, setup, benefits, height, when you should consider it, where to begin. So pin press, when you basically you're using a rack and you're going to be pushing off of the pin, that's going to depend on your weakness. So if you don't necessarily have a weakness, then start from bottom up or start from top down and just hit different holes depending on what you're capable of getting in your rack. But it, if you have a sticky point, then you want to go just below that sticky point and try to press off of that sticky point and get used to that. But then make sure that you tie it back into the full lift. So your body's getting strong here, but then you're actually training it through the full lift as well. So if you have a sticky point, get it just below that sticky point and try to move through it. You can work just slightly above it, just slightly below it. I prefer below first, unless it's too difficult, but you have to do it with obviously a weight that you can use. And then just work throughout all the different ranges, because it doesn't hurt to have partial ranges of motion as long as you're consistently tying it back into the full range of motion so you don't lose the ability. Good question, Phil. Hope that helped. Training for a better arch. Training for a better arch. Number one, you're going to be limited by your spine. So everyone's spine has different flexibility abilities. So not everyone is a gymnast that can go into a full back bend, and you don't have to be. Some people have a minor arch. Some people have a bigger arch. A bigger arch can create a little bit more biomechanical advantage if you're competing. But if you don't have the ability to do it, then maximize what you can do. And that's going to come through good hip extension. That's glute activation. And that's, again, when I talk about activation, you guys will hear about this in the next two presentations. Activation is the ability for it to turn on demand. It's not how strong you are in a glute bridge. That has nothing to do with what you can get and how you can activate your tissue. So activation is what can I do on demand that's going to fire right away that creates stability. So to get a better extension is you have to be able to train the body in extension, but you also have to be able to train it in flexion. You need to have both, and you need to be able to rotate as well. You can't just constantly train extension without flexion, because then you'll create an actual predisposition to injury. So glutes are going to be a huge thing. The actual extenders, being able to get those to activate, and that means getting into a position and being able to hold it there. So if you're doing some back extensions off of a back extension bench, be able to bring that up and hold that and come up to where you can get into your full range of motion and be able to hold that position for 5 or so seconds. Not about weight. It's about, can you get into the position and hold that position? And it's not killing you. It's a lightweight. It's like less than 30% of a max that you need to do. It's the activation component that will help, not how strong, meaning how much load we put on. That's a huge misnomer. We'll talk about that later. Okay, and that's it. So I'm going to go ahead and shut down. For those of you that stayed, all 68 of you, that was awesome. I deeply appreciate it. I hope you guys enjoyed this. I hope it was beneficial. I hope to see you guys on the next one. Maximize your training results, part 1 and part 2. Have a great rest of your week and have a great weekend. Thanks, guys.